Okay, so I did my project on the Miller and the Manciple. And my big idea for the Miller and the Manciple is that they consume more than they need and that they're greedy. The Miller comes from the lower class, and it is said that he could win the ram at any wrestling match. And the Chaucer views him as dishonest because he is known for stealing. And the quote I have for that is, "His was a master hand at stealing grain." That's line 578. And the Miller represents the sins of gluttony and avarice because he takes what he thinks he is due, even if it is more than what he was given. And the quote I have for that is, "He felt it with his thumb, and thus he knew its quality and took 3 times his due." And he also represents avarice by stealing the grain, like actually committing the act of stealing. And the next character I had was the Manciple, and he comes from the inner temple, but he is also part of the lower class. And he is known for buying the food and the supplies for higher up people. And I would say he represents the deadly sin of avarice, just like the Miller, because when he goes out to the market, he is always the first one there, and he buys whatever he needs and doesn't care how much he spends and how much he buys, even if it's not needed. And I say that represents avarice because it's not necessarily greed for himself, but it's greed to make him look better, because he buys all that stuff to make himself look better. And the quote I have for that is, "He was never rash whether he bought on credit or paid cash, because he didn't care how much he spent." And the Chaucer saw the Manciple as uneducated because he was very uneducated. And both characters have avarice in common because they both have greed. And to start with the Miller, the Miller could go and win any ram at any wrestling show. He was broad, naughty, and short-shouldered. He would boast he could lift any door off of the hinge and post, and that he could break it with his head. And his beard was red and broad as well. On his nose at the top, he had a wart with hair. He has red hairs in his ears. His nostrils were as black as they were wide. He always had a sword and a buckler by his side. His mouth was like a furnace door. He wore a hood of blue and a white coat, and he liked to display his bagpipes up and down, and the Chaucer describes him as wide and black. And then for the Miller artifacts, I did a bagpipe, a sword, and a ram. For the bagpipe, I chose bagpipe because he liked playing his bagpipes for the people, and he most time had them with him so he could play it. And the quote I have for it is, "He liked to play his bagpipes up and down, and that was how he brought us out of town." The second artifact, I had a sword because he never went anywhere without it, and he always had a sword by his side. And the quote I had for that was, "He had a sword and a buckler at his side." And for the third artifact, I chose a ram because this represents his greatness out of the 16, and it shows his success of the wrestling shows he went out to win. And the quote I had for that was, "He did well out of them, for he could go and win the ram at any wrestling show." And then next is the Manciple. And for the Manciple, I said the Manciple came from the inner temple. He would watch the market precisely, and he would go in first. His masters all versed in the obstructed legal knowledge. He lived a debt-free life. He was in charge of purchasing food and supplies for an institution like a school, a monastery, or law court. He had light brown hair with a beard. He wears a blue robe and a red cap. The Chaucer describes him as clever and as well as charismatic. He is illiterate, however, he doesn't let this affect his position in the world. And for the artifacts of the Manciple, I used food, money, and the market. For the food, I used this as a representation of what he would go out and buy for the higher class. He would buy food and the supplies they needed. And the quote I have for this is, all caterers might follow his example in buying victuals. He was never rash. And the next artifact I have is the money. And I chose the money because he would spend however much he needed. He never really cared, and he would spend however much he needed to buy the food and supplies. And the quote I used for that was, whether he bought it on credit or paid cash. And the next artifact is the market, and the market represents how loyal he was to his job as the Manciple. He was always the first one to go in the market to complete his job of buying supplies. Like, he wanted to get the job done and correctly. And the quote I used for that was, he used to watch the market most precisely and go in first, and he did so, and so he did quite nicely. And then for the curator's office, I just said, hi, my name is Tori Leeper. I'm a junior at Teohenna High School. I play softball, and I am the creator of this museum. And then for my references,